Testing, 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 testing for interview with Mrs. Vandergrift's sister. Testing tape. Testing. Okay, testing. Testing, testing, testing. What is your name now?
Davis?
Mrs. Davis. An interview with Mrs. Davis, the sister of Mrs. Vandergrift.
Oh, I'm her mother.
Mother. Oh, yes, mother of Mrs. Vandergrift. All right, just 1 minute. We'll test and see if this is recording. Mrs. Davis, we're so glad to have you today for our interview and to add your story to those of our other stories of our early days in Oklahoma. Uh, I believe your name was Eva Merle Miner, Miner.
That's right.
And your name now is Mrs. Davis, Davis.
I'm a widow.
Mrs. What was his name?
Davis, H.A., Henry A.
Henry A. Davis. She is a widow now. She was born in 1885 in October, and at about 8 years of age, they came to the Strip. Now we're going to let her tell you how it happened that he got this piece of land and how her father brought his family to Oklahoma.
Well, they were, that was from Cherokee Strip, the race into the Strip, when they gathered at Caldwell, Kansas, and at the sound of a shot of a gun, why, they all started to the Strip to stake a piece of land, which a lot of them did. Some of them didn't get the prize, but some of them got good farms, and ours, he raised 5 daughters on it and a son, 6 daughters and a son, and one of them was born there, and the others came from Kansas, all of them. And it was opened in September 16th, 1893, and he did get a farm in Garfield County, which is the second county from the north, the 160 acres, which was later just given to the farmers, you know. And we started down there. We got there in December. Well, I guess we started in December because we wasn't very far from the border, from Kansas and Oklahoma. But it was a covered wagon, and they had a few chickens, and a horse and a mule hitched to the wagon, and the 5 girls, and mother and father in the wagon. And I don't remember just how long it did take, but father was never one to push his livestock very fast, and so we didn't travel very, very fast. But we got to the banks of the Salt Fork River on the 22nd of December, I think it was, and we drove on out to the farm, which was 13 miles from there, from a little town they later named Pond Creek, and it was on the Rock Island Railroad, and we drove on out to the farm the very next day, which was only about 13 miles, and wasn't a thing on the farm except grass, and there was a little creek run through it, but there's no water running at that time. But he proceeded to dig into the one side of a hill and then we dug back far enough. I don't know how far to say, whether it was 20 or 30 feet or what, but he sodded up the front of it and made 2 rooms out of it. And he went over to Kremlin, which is 4 miles away, on the Rock Island Railroad, and got lumber to roof it. And he did that practically with the help of the family, because we were some of the very first ones in that neighborhood. But when spring came, they commenced moving in on the different farms around. And mother was quite pregnant. There was another little baby come in January, but only lived 3 weeks. And we had a few chickens for a start of a chicken group, but we didn't have any cows or anything like that, so we did without milk. Did without a lot of things, but Father went over to Kremlin now and then to get other food, you know. And then he'd go down to a little patch of shrub oak, they called it the blackjacks, to get wood to burn. And they just gave him the wood because it was help clearing land that they wanted for farming. And that was, I think, 40 miles away, something like that. But he'd get his load and bring it back, and he'd cut what wood we wanted, and then he'd take some over to Kremlin and sell that after it was cut up for firewood, you know. And in the spring, when other neighbors commenced to move in, there was another family from the same neighborhood came, and I think we got a cow from him, so we had milk. And then he bought a cow, and then he bought another house from this same neighbor. And one of Father's brothers moved into the neighborhood about 4 miles away, I guess it was, but it wasn't in our school district. We didn't have any school that year, of course, but I think the farmers paid a teacher to, and I don't think the districts were laid out for the next term. But there's a widow woman that had filed on a quarter section, and they had to put up a little building to sleep in it 3 nights in order to hold land, and they sodded that little cottage up. There's only 1 room, and we used. They made something kind of like a sawhorse and just planks for seats. And the farmers themselves paid a teacher that come from the same neighborhood we did in Kansas, and he taught that first term. But after that, why, the county sort of took over, you know. And we only went 3 months. But when we had the sod to keep it warm more than anything else. But the house was sodded up. The front of the house was sodded up too. The other was dug in the back of the hill. But the front of it was sodded up.
And that was how he kept warm.
Well, he had a little, I think what they called it, a monkey stove that we brought down there, that he brought in the wagon too, you know. I don't know how on earth five children and the mother and father slept in that covered wagon, but we did while we were building that too.
Mm-hmm. What about your first Christmas? But you arrived there right close to Christmas, didn't you?
Yes, the oldest sister's birthday was the 24th of December, but and that last camping out was the 23rd, I think, on Salt Fork River, up by Pond Creek, where Pond Creek has been later, but it wasn't there then. But that's where we cooked on the last campfires up there on that river, you know. And it was only 13 miles from the farm anyway. But Enid was the county seat of Garfield County. It sort of seems to me, yeah, Pond Creek was in Garfield County too, I guess. But, and then there was just one 30-mile county between there and the Kansas border. It was only about 60 foot north and south, the strip was, but then it was farther east and west. And the Rock Island Railroad run through there anyway, you know, and the Father said that some of those people that stake claims come in on the railroad and then they jump off and go and stake farms, you know. But some of them didn't stay long. And then he got what they called a sod plow and just used that horse and mule to break sod, to sod up the front of it, and then for the field the next summer. And our first, seems to me he tried corn first, but anyhow, somebody, don't know where they were now, would give you castor oil beans for seed, but the government or state or something sort of offered them so much for a bushel of that to kind of start them off and hold them over, you know, and to have a little something to live on. But I know over there at Kremlin once, I think he was a German or something like that, to put in a little story. His name was Gummerson anyway, and he stayed there a long time. But he'd helped to put the railroad through too. But he'd ordered some salt fish once, and they couldn't sell salt fish. A lot of people didn't like it, and then a lot of people didn't have money to buy it. So they gave my father quite a little salt fish once in a keg, you know. So that's one thing we had to eat was salt
Came
fish.
in lucky, didn't it?
Yeah, it did, sure did.
Your daughter was laughing about some of the things that you used to make do with.
We never had dolls at all. We had to make.
She was
these
talking
things
about
for little
dolls and
girls.
about the way you used tumbleweed.
Well, I was telling her last night the tumbleweeds. Well, this is in Kansas, so where we used tumbleweeds to make bustles. They'd break off in the fall, you know, and go tumbling over the prairie, and we'd pick 'em up and use 'em for bustles. There's little girls. The oldest was getting to think she was kind of a young lady in a way, and that was a part of our pastime. And then after Father came back from being down there the first time, we'd take our stick horses and we'd ride 'em over the hill, and we'd stake farms. And that was our farm, you know, a certain piece of ground over the hill in the pasture. But then they decided to go on back down right away because they didn't own property there. They had just rented and farmed, you know. But we farmed he had a cornfield some way, and he sold the corn and sold it, and the cobs, we gave the cobs to an uncle, or aunt it was really, and we'd had the stick horses, and we tied the stick horses. You know what the end gate to a wagon bed was?
Mm-hmm.
Well, they took the stick horses and tied them to that one
Just
end
like
of,
the real one.
yeah, and took 'em home with them, the cousins, you know, after we were through with the stick horses and ready to go to Oklahoma. Why, the cousins took the stick horses with them, and that's one thing she was laughing about. Said she'd never heard that until I was telling her that day. But
Just a minute, let's test this machine again on this.
some does come, some.
Here we go. Today we have a most interesting interview. A baby girl who was born in 1887 in what was then the unassigned lands, but sometimes called the Oklahoma lands, assisted by Miss Miss Edna Couch, excuse me, and the date is Friday, July the 8th, 1972. We are recording at OCC. We hope that Miss Couch will assist as much as possible. The first the first voice that we will hear will be that of Mrs. Oklahoma Kettner. Her maiden name was Bucher, Bucher, and sometimes spelled Bugher. We want to know a little bit more about that story. The unusual time and place of birth makes it a most interesting one.
I was born in 1887, which is now Oklahoma City, is my birthplace. And my father made the run in 1887. The run was made at Purcell, Oklahoma. When we went, Mother took us children, wagon, made the run across the Canadian River at Purcell, Oklahoma, where we were camped just before the run.
So your birth then was on the, or near the station, or what would be the station, there at the railroad
Purcell.
at Purcell.
Oklahoma.
I'm going to ask for a little comment on this now.
Oklahoma Boofer Kettner was born on the Santa Fe right-of-way near or in what is now Oklahoma City. This was the unassigned lands, and her father and family were living in a tent, hoping that the unassigned lands would be opened. Mr. Boofer had been a member of the Boomer movement. We have a document from the National Archives in Washington, D.C., in which he has signed his name to a petition which was sent to Washington in March of 1885. His name and number as a Boomer member of the Boomers is in Paine's notebook, along with two other Boofers who I believe were possibly relatives of his. In regard to their being on the Santa Fe tracks or near the Santa Fe tracks, and of course the railroad had built through from the fall of 1886 to April 1887, and at the time she was born on April the 10th, 1887, the railroad construction had continued farther south. We have the original letter in the family from a friend who apparently was camped with them, and it is dated Caldwell, Kansas, April the 10th, 1887, and he says, "Dear friend Booker," he wondered if he got to stay, because the soldiers had come and asked the people who were camped there to move out. And Mr. Boofer went to the officer and asked them to be permitted to remain until after the birth of their child. And so the officer gave this permission. In 1889, there was a book published in Chicago which tells about the birth of Oklahoma near the Santa Fe tracks, and I have it somewhere here.
We'd like to have that read. If you have a brief account from that, we would like to have it on the tape, because it's such an interesting situation.
Oh, here, she's got it over here. Me looking for it.
Just a minute. She's ready now.
This is an account in Oklahoma, The Beautiful Land by H.E. Jefferson, which was published in Chicago in 1889. Copies of this book, I think, are rather rare. The only one that I know of is in the vault at the Historical Society. A number of incidents had been reported, and I will read this, which concerns Oklahoma. More serious than this experience was that of Mrs. Anna Booker. With her husband, she was living in a tent on the North Fork of the Canadian, not far from Oklahoma City, in April 1887. The Bookers were one of many stray Boomers who had gone into Oklahoma singly, hoping to thereby escape the soldiers and hold a claim. On April the 10th, the girl baby was born, with no one to care for the mother or child save the father, who could not, of course, leave her, let alone go 50 miles to the nearest skilled help. 3 days later, while the life of the mother still hung in the balance, came a troop of soldiers and ordered the family to move at once. Mrs. Boofer became wild at once, and her husband very nearly so. The soldiers had orders to instantly remove all settlers found in the territory, and they were just well enough trained to want to obey orders no matter what the consequences. The corporal in charge finally agreed to consult a superior officer before using force on the helpless family. The lieutenant ordered the case, reported the case to the commandant. As a special favor, a stay of execution of 11 days was granted. On the day that baby was 2 weeks old, although the mother was still unable to walk, the whole outfit was tumbled into a springless army wagon and started for the line. Purcell had at that time just been laid out as a town, and the Boofers were permitted to stay there. The child was the second white child born in Oklahoma. Her name is Oklahoma Boofer.
Very good. Thank you so much, Miss Katz. You were telling an incident a while ago about the joining of the tracks and the sheriff, the difficulty he had serving the papers on certain injunctions. Would you mind repeating that for me?
Construction of the Santa Fe commenced at Arkansas City, or south of Arkansas City, across the unassigned lands in September of 1886. Construction went along, and by November they had completed 30 miles of track to Ponca, which later was named White Eagle. The connection, the writ, the charter called for the completion of the line to meet with the Gulf Railroad, which was building up from the south, to meet at what was then called Walnut Creek on April the 20th, 1887. This was just about 10 days after Oklahoma was born at what is now Oklahoma City. The work lagged as they approached Walnut Creek, and the construction engineer, that is the roadmaster, heard about an injunction which had been issued at Muskogee, which would stop the construction of the line and cancel the charter. This was given to a U.S. Marshal to serve on the railroad employees. And however, the roadmaster telegraphed Mr. Robinson, the chief engineer for the Santa Fe in Topeka, about this. He had heard of it, and Mr. Robinson sent his chief clerk, a Mr. Curtis, bouncing down the track in a bunk car hooked to an old locomotive. And he picked up all of the railroad employees, telegraph operators, anybody that was and a Santa Fe employee. He picked them all up, put them in the bump car, and took them down there to the south end of the track and kept them there. And the marshal rode up and down the track trying to find somebody on whom to serve the writ, and found nobody. So on the evening of April 26, 1887, 6 days after the railroad was to have been completed, he rode into the railroad camp at what is now Purcell on his jaded horse. He came up to Curtis and said, I have to serve a writ because the railroad wasn't completed on time. And Mr. Curtis said that the railroad is completed. Look for yourself. So he hobbled over to the railroad track, and sure enough it was, and he shook his head, scratched his hair, and said, and that's the last that they heard of the writ.
Thank you so much. Those colorful stories are most interesting. Mrs. Kettner, where were you? Where did you get your schooling? Where were you in school?
The Kennedy School,
The Kennedy
District 49.
Was it a 3-month school or a 6-month school or?
Oh, no, I was there until I was graduated
Oh.
from
usually those early schools were sometimes called subscription schools, and they ran sometimes 3 months, and then
Oh, no,
fields
this was
works came in, and then they sometimes would have longer schools. Yours was the full-length school.
I attended it at 5 years old
Yeah.
until I completed.
My, went right straight through. Um, did you have a particular field of interest in your education? Did you have what we'd call a major, or
No,
something that you were interested
no,
in,
we just
especially
had
certain
assistant
things?
and principal teachers, Nora and Gertie Pamtier was their
And you had a certain course prescribed, and you just took that and went right
Uh-huh.
straight through.
That's right.
That's the way they were.
Uh-huh. That's the way they were. We got a prescription to not
School.
college, school.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Were there any churches in the area at that time?
We went to church at the Canada School. It was the first Christian church, and we attended church at the Canada School. That was our church and school.
Did other denominations meet in that building also, or was there
No,
just the
it
one,
was
just the
the
one
first-
denomination?
Uh-huh. Yes, the Christian church, it was called.
Well, that'd apply to all of them anyway, wouldn't it?
Yes, I presume it would.
The amusements of that time. What did you do? If you had what we call spare time now.
Oh, yes. Well, we had exhibitions and so forth. I was principal speaker. I spoke Nelly's Prayer and the Lion's Bride. And they had me, Gerda, and the principal and assistant teacher to speak, and we'd have at the exhibition.
Oh yes, they called that elocution, didn't they then?
Exhibitions.
Exhibitions?
Exhibitions.
I remember when some of those students in what we'd call speech today were called elocution students.
Well, they'd have dialogues
Uh-huh.
and speeches to have a program,
Yes.
and we'd get up and speak and put on the dialogues.
Hmm. Were there any, besides these dramatics, were there any other amusements or family get-togethers or things?
Oh yes, we'd have picnics and dinners on the ground.
What'd you do the 4th of July in those years?
Oh, we'd have firecrackers and just
Speakers?
speakers. That's right. We'd have speakers.
Picnic lunches, I guess.
Yes. They'd have picnics and merry-go-rounds and things like that of amusements.
I talked to a lady the other day who is in her 80s, and she said that her granddaughters had suddenly been coming over to her house almost every day trying to learn to quilt again. And she said she hadn't quilted in years. Did they have those community quiltings then?
Yes, we had quiltings where we'd go and quilt. Yes, we did.
That was considered an amusement too, as well as something worthwhile,
Yes,
wasn't it?
that's right. It was amusements.
Your name being Oklahoma, have they ever nicknamed you?
No.
Um,
Well, no, it was Oklahoma. Well, someone called me Okie, but that really wasn't my name.
Your name was Okie then long before the rest of us began to be called Okies.
Yes, there was a girl that had Noble, Oklahoma, that was, her name was Okie, and I don't know, they just nicknamed me and they'd call me Okie. Well, some would call me Oklahoma or Okla for short.
Yeah.
But some would call me Okie, and I don't know why.
The original Okie.
There.
Miss, I believe we have an early card here of some kind of hers.
This is a souvenir of Kennedy School in 1886-87, and Oklahoma Boofer's name is on here, and down here in the list of students is Okie Boofer, and they've misspelled Boofer. In fact, all the Boofers are misspelled, Bougher, instead of leaving the O out. And there's over here in the first column, there's Lula Boofer, Eva Boofer. In the second column is Gracie Boofer and Okie Boofer. And in the third column, now it's Okie, not Okla. We sometimes call her Okla, but this printed on here. And in the third column is Vina, her younger sister, who was born about 1892 or 93. So apparently these were the students according to their grades in this school, and I think this is real important, interesting, and it has the names of the directors of the school board and the county superintendent, and then the principal, Maggie Alford, principal, and Marrie. I don't know how they call that. Alford as assistant. So
Marie.
yeah, well, it has two R's in it, which sort of threw me.
And Maggie Alford.
Yeah, well, these two are on here.
Were these others listed on this? Were these your sisters?
Yes,
Uh-huh.
that's my sister.
That was your family then
Yes.
on that. Well, this is interesting. And where are these documents kept? Where can they be found?
Mrs. Ward, Vina, or Lavina Boofer Ward, wants these given to the Cleveland County Historical Society when we get a place to put them, and consequently she has entrusted them to me for the last several months, and as long as she entrusts them to me, I'll take good care of them. But some of these days she may change her mind and put them somewhere else. I don't know.
Well, I'm sure that they're going to find them most interesting. Just 1 second now. Let's check this and see where we are. Different. I believe that you mentioned that your
My
father
was-
and your mother were camping, hoping that the Oklahoma lands would be open real soon. We wonder if you could tell us just a little bit more about your mother first.
Well, she was born in Kansas,
Her name?
Abilene, Kansas. Her name was Anna Reinhardt.
How do you
Boo-
spell Reinhardt?
R-I-H-A-R-T. And father was born in Ohio. But I don't know just what year, honey, he was born.
And his full name was
Louis Booker.
Louis
Louis.
Booker.
L-E-W-I-S. Louis.
Louis Booker. All right. We found a letter here that perhaps some excerpts from it, since he was a prospector, and this might be interesting.
I've made some excerpts from this letter, which I'll quote a little bit later, but let me first tell you a little bit about Louis Boofer. Some material that I've collected. Louis Boofer was born in Ohio, October the 28th, 1819. He sometimes spelled his name B-U-C-H-E-R and sometimes B-U-G-H-E-R. His family does not know when the migration tide swept him westward. According to the census of 1890, he served in the Colorado Home Guard for 3 months in 1862. He married Annie Reinhardt, her family also from Ohio. They bought 1,200 acres of wheat land between Abilene and Solomon City, Kansas, and built a large house. How proud they must have been of their first 3 children, all sons: Louis Bartlett Buford, Robert Edward Buford, Benjamin Franklin Buford. Then came a daughter, Eva May, also born in Dickinson County. Early in 1880, Louis Buford and his brother, Peter Buford, went prospecting for silver in Idaho. From Bullion City, Louis wrote a letter to his wife Annie just before Christmas, 1880. I am yet in the land of the living and am well. The mail has been stopped for several weeks on account of deep snow, but I hope we will get it through on snowshoes so we can hear from each other at least. The snow has been 4 feet deep, but had settled down to 3 feet. Buford was working the Little Frank mine. I call it that when I struck it, but it has to be the Big Frank, the best mine on Wood River. Last summer, a mine within a mile of Little Frank had sold for $500,000. Coat, I can just bet them that I can take 2 tons of ore out of the Little Frank for their one with the same force of hands, unquote. Coat again. Now as it is drawing nigh unto Christmas, I hope you will have a good time while I am in these lonely, snowy mountains, but I am going to pay for it in the spring. Enough to live on for the balance of our days. Well, I must close. God bless you and the children. In May 1882, from Bellevue, Idaho, Buford wrote his wife another letter treasured by his daughter, Mrs. Lavina Ward. Coat, 2 parties are here to buy me out, and I think it will go in a few days. One of the parties is from Leadville, Colorado, and Mr. Hedrick, a good friend of mine, tells me to stand firm to my price, $160,000. Buford was staying around town waiting for the deal to go through, and for pastime was writing letters. He had men working the Forest Green mine, Coat, which I also expect to sell at once. The Battlesons had 15 feet of ore at the depth of 120 feet. It had cost him about $2,000 to make an incline to the Forest Green mine, but he had 4 feet of solid silver ore within 8 feet of the surface of the ground. Nobody knows what Louis Buford got for his mines, but in the spring of 1887, Louis was back in Kansas. He joined Payne's Oklahoma Colony on April the 28th, 1884, for his name and certificate number were written in David Payne's notebook, which is at the Oklahoma Historical Society. David Payne was just back from Washington, D.C., where he had been all winter trying to get Congress to open the unassigned lands, sometimes called Oklahoma lands. About 100 boomers were camped around Arkansas City, and on May the 1st they started for the Oklahoma lands. Buford may have made the trip with them, but nobody knows. That spring, about 1884, prospects of the unassigned lands being opened looked very good, and Buford sold his land in Dickinson County and moved to Douglas in Butler County to be near the land the boomers proposed to settle. His daughter Gracie was born at Douglas in November 1884. Then spring came. Buford was still waiting for the land to be opened, for he was one of 25 men from different parts of the country who signed a petition which was sent to President Cleveland asking for the opening of the Oklahoma lands. This petition was dated March the 21st, 1885. Buford signed from Idaho. I think that is enough about, we've already covered some more of this.
Now that is Louis
This is
Louis Butcher.
Buford,
Buford, the father of
Oklahoma.
Oklahoma. That was interesting, and I didn't know that that we'd had the name Okie ever used before. I thought that was a real new nomenclature.
On this school card
Yes.
here, somebody spelled it O-K-I-E, Okie.
OKIE, that's
And,
it.
That's
We call her,
a nickname that they gave me, and I don't know why.
we call her Okla now, or
Yes.
Oakley, or
That's
something like
Yeah.
that.
I was named when I
Uh-huh.
was born. Oh,
Well, for Oklahoma. Is there any incident or anything now that you would like to tell us about that?
that happened.
Yes.
Well, she's going to tell you about her children and her grandchildren pretty soon.
All
Or
right.
did she tell you that?
No.
Yes.
No, I didn't get that on
You
tape.
didn't?
No, the number in your in your mother's family, mother's and father's family, and then we want to know something about your children and grandchildren.
Well, I have, I, mother, they were 8 in our home, in our family. And I had 10 children of my own, 23 grandchildren, and 47 great-grandchildren.
My goodness.
As of this day.
Pardon?
As of right now.
Yes, right now.
All right, thank you very much. Do you care to add something? Do you have some of the other references you'd like to mention? Do you want to tell us anything about the article on Robinson? Would you rather not put that on tape right now?
Oh, I don't mind.
Interesting.
Just recently, in fact, I've been fiddling with the thing for 2 years. I had a book which told a lot about Mr. Robinson, for whom Robinson Avenue was named, and after I'd had the book and read it several times, I think I had it about 6 or 7 years, it finally dawned on me that this Mr. Robinson was the man for whom Robinson Avenue was named, although no place in history does it mention that this is the man. You had to sort of come to the conclusion that this was the man. And so I commenced fiddling with this story and thinking about it about 2 years ago and wrote up several versions of it. He was quite a fantastic man, a railroad man. And due to the fact that I do genealogy research, when I found out that he was born in Windsor County, Vermont in 1884, I looked him up in the census and found the family there. And another interesting fact, while I was looking for him, I happened to stop the film on a page which at the top of the page said, "This is the family, this is the father, the grandfather, and the great-grandfather of Calvin Coolidge, President of the United States." So when I looked on the map, I found that Calvin Coolidge's father, who was John Calvin Coolidge, was born the very same year that Mr. Robinson was born, in 1884, about 12 Hoop and Holler miles away at Plymouth Notch, Vermont. And but I didn't mention the fact that John Calvin Coolidge was born that same year, only about 12 miles away, but I did leave it in that Mr. Robinson was born about 12 Hoop and Holler miles from Plymouth Notch, because it sounded a lot more romantic than to say that the name of the town near which he was born. And so I fiddled with this thing and thought about it, and then finally narrowed it down to only facts about Mr. Robinson, the kind of a man he was, and the incidents which were related to Oklahoma. He did many brave and wonderful things in railroad construction, which only part of it had anything to do with Oklahoma. And just recently I sent it to Mr. Ed Montgomery at the Oklahoman. He's city editor for the Daily Oklahoman. And I had asked him if he would read it, and he turned it over to the editor, Elwyn Hatfield of Orbit, and it was accepted recently to be published later sometime this year. He could not give me a publication date, but I tied the thing in with the Marriott Convention Center and the Marriott Gardens because Robinson Avenue is a very important street, or the important street between these two. And since the Marriott Convention Center will be open sometime this winter, I feel that possibly the Oklahoman will have a special edition and want to use this with that edition of the newspaper. I haven't told anybody except the very closest friends Mr. Robinson's first names. George Shirk knows that his initials were A.A. Robinson, but if he knew what A.A. stood for, he didn't tell me, and I don't think he knows.
Then we're going to have to wait till we get the orbit before we find out. Now, that's one way to really pick our interest, isn't it? Well, thank you so much. Do you have anything further you'd like to tell us about your family or yourself?
Well, there was a little incident after our new two-story home was built. We had a beautiful front porch, and we'd go out there the evening to a set after dinner, or supper, and we call it
Yeah.
dinner now. But I went to sleep. We, like children will, lay down and go to sleep. And they all went in and forgot me and went to bed. And I was laying at the door that came into the hallway. And Mother came down from upstairs, and there I laid, and she said there was a big big diamond rattlesnake coiled up on my breast. And she run back and told Father, she said, and he said, "You be real quiet." And he got the broom, and he just in under it and slung it off and killed it. And he killed it. If I'd have wakened, it would have bit me, but I was sound asleep. And I hadn't moved, I don't think. And and it just coiled up there, and it was warm. And we slept together.
Ooh, that would have been a terrible bedfellow. Do you have anything further that you would like to add?
In 1969, Oklahoma Buford Kettner was here at the time of the 89er banquet, which always takes place on April the 22nd, and she and her sister attended the banquet with me, and she has her picture among the other original 89ers, of which there were maybe 25 or so. I'm looking at the picture. April the 27th, 1969 was when it was published in the Oklahoma Journal. She has been able to be here for some of the 89er celebrations, and this year she didn't quite make it, but anyway, we've been so happy to have her here for these occasions.
And where's your residence now?
Pardon?
Where do you live now?
Clovis, California is where I live.
That's where you call home?
I
Why,
call it
you
home. I'm on a 20-acre ranch.
You really left the land of your birth then. You can't be an
Oh.
Okie in California.
I raised my children all here before I went there.
Well,
I
that's
didn't
giving them a
children.
good start. That's giving
Yeah.
them a good start then.
I raised me.
Well, we're glad that you get back to see us anyway.
Baby was 10 years
Because with a name like that, we still claim you. We'll have to. Is there anything further?
Thank you.
I don't think so. I don't know.
Well, I thank you ladies so much for a most interesting time here, and I'm so glad that we got our Okie, and thank you very much, Miss Couch, for bringing her over. It's a pleasure indeed to have you,
Well, thank you. It's
and
been
we're
a
so
pleasure
glad to have
with
you.
I don't think of anything else. We do appreciate having Oakley come to see us every once in a while, and it was really because her sister, Lavina Buford Ward, went to the Historical Society trying to find the story of her birth, which they knew had been published somewhere in a newspaper, but they didn't know where nor when. And when she was talking with Mrs. Cook in the newspaper room, and they looked and looked, and of course in 1887 there were a few Indian newspapers being published in Oklahoma, but there really wasn't, well, even the Cheyenne Transporter had quit publication the August before, so there was really no place that her birth could be mentioned. And Mrs. Cook told her, gave her my name and address, and told her that I lived in Norman, and said if there's any newspaper that story might be in, she'll know about it. So about 3 weeks later, Mrs. Ward called me and said she wanted to come by and talk to me, and she brought some of these old letters, and at that time I borrowed them and took them down to the university and Xeroxed them. Before she came, though, Mrs. Cook had told me that somebody by the name of Ward was trying to find her sister, and that she would probably be calling on me, and so I really wasn't surprised. But it's on account of this that I know Oklahoma and her sister Lavina, and maybe otherwise I wouldn't have known them at all. About 4 years ago, I was in charge of a program at the Cleveland County Historical Society meeting, and we featured 5 old families, and the Buford family was one of the old ones that we had people tell about. These old original families that had settled in Cleveland County. Usually the people in Oklahoma County, most of us think about the run coming from the north, but in Cleveland County we have to remember that the settlers down there came from the south, and there's an awful lot of old original families that are still down there in Cleveland County, and very proud of the fact that their folks made the run and settled on that land down there. And I think the Historical Society is making an effort to round up some of these people. And just since we've been sitting here, I've been thinking of some that, of course, the originals are gone, but there's quite a number of people down in there that still own the land. The families own the land, which has been in the family ever since.
Well, thank you so much, Miss Gadd.
I'd like to. I went to San Diego, California in 1940 and resided there up till this date. This is July 8th, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I live in Clovis, California.
Well, we lend you to California, and then you come back here. All right. Well, thank you so much. We appreciate it from both of you. Thank you very much, and we appreciate it. So glad you brought her over. Yeah.